and welcome to the Content Bite, a podcast for freelancers who use their words to make money. I'm Rachel Smith, a freelance journalist, copywriter, and content producer. I'm also the founder of Rachel's List, a jobs board and community for Australian writers and other creatives.
And I'm Lynne Testoni. I'm a journalist and a content writer as well. Rachel and I are your weekly co-hosts, and every week we're bringing you all kinds of tips, tricks, and some fabulous guests to help you make the most of your freelance business. This podcast is sponsored by our good friends at Rounded, easy accounting and invoicing software made just for Australian freelancers and sole traders. It's everything you need to make freelancing easier. Find out more at rounded.com.au.
Also, if you're a gold member of Rachel's List, Rounded is giving you 20% off an annual subscription plan. Upgrade to gold membership for all the details.
Hi, Rach. Great to be back on the pod again. And this week's guest is another freelancer who is the perfect multitasker. That's something we all admire. And she's someone I've worked with and I have such huge respect for.
Yes, I am so thrilled as well to have Lee Tran Lam on this week. She is such an innovator. She's had a successful podcast for years now, and she also has a really great writing career. We've just been talking offline about all the bylines that we have tried to get over the years, which is really fascinating. She's going to share a lot with us today.
Tell us all about Lee Tran.
So Lee Tran Lam is a freelance multitasker and journalist. She created and hosts the podcast, The Unbearable Lightness of Being Hungry. What an awesome name. I love that. Her work has appeared in publications such as The Guardian, Punch, Gourmet Traveller, Rolling Stone, The Big Issue, Time Out Sydney, Sydney Morning Herald, and SBS Food. Some amazing bylines there. She also hosts Local Fidelity, a show on Sydney community radio station FBI. Welcome, Lee Tran.
Yeah, welcome. It's so great to have you join us.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Because I'd love to talk to you about your love of food, because when we worked together, which is a while ago, you had your blog and that was the name, wasn't it?
The Unbearable Lightness of Being Hungry.
Yeah, you've been interested in food writing for such a long time. And I seem to remember your blog being around well before anyone else was blogging. How long has it been going?
Yeah, so I started it in October 2007. I'm not the first. I think maybe the first or one of the earliest in Australia is Helen, who does Grab Your Fork.
Oh, yeah, I know Helen.
Yes, and she started doing it before iPhones existed. So that's
wow.
How early on she was, jumped onto the scene. And I was inspired to do it. I think it was the first time in my life I had more than pizza money. So, I could afford, to save up for a few nice places. And it felt like, at the end of the night, you don't want this memory to just disappear with the bill and the amount you spent on the meal, which sometimes can really rack up. So I thought it'd be really nice to document it on a food blog. And also, I think it was a time in Sydney where the dining scene was really changing. And I think there was an attitude I remember amongst my friends that was like, oh, if you want something to happen, you have to move to New York or you have to move to London. And I felt like, no, why don't you stay here and kind of celebrate what's awesome about Sydney? And I was also trying to use the food blog to almost when you're in another city, you have all this curiosity and you want to try all these different places. And I thought, why not treat your own city in the same way? Because there are all these hidden gems you probably don't know about until you go looking for them.
Yeah, amazing. So it's kind of like this love letter to Sydney and to Sydney's food, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure. And, it led to some really interesting opportunities, which I think we might talk about later. And I have to say, Lynne and I worked at Inside Out magazine a little while back. I started there, I think maybe 2006. So just before I started my food blog. The editor at the time was Karen McCartney, who's a total legend, amazing to work with, one of the best editors I've ever worked with. But my job was deputy chief sub-editor. So for people who don't know, sub-editing, you're doing a lot of nitty-gritty work. And I was doing things like having to fact check, the price of a tile or, the name of a carpet or, check lots of phone numbers. So it's important work because if you get the business phone number in a magazine incorrect, it really sucks for the person who is the supplier and the reader who wants that information. But creatively, it doesn't use all of your brain, you know?
Yeah.
So doing the food blog was really good because it allowed me to use the more creative parts of my brain.
Yeah, that's so true what you say about subbing. I used to sub and I'd be subbing all these great stories that were coming through, and I'd just be getting progressively more and more jealous of, because I wanted to be writing them. And I thought, I just don't think that I'm cut out for subbing because I want to be on the other side of it. Yeah, but it's good to do. It's really a good thing to do if you need a bit of a break and you just want to put your brain through something that's not too taxing in a way. Yeah.
It's also a great discipline for your writing, isn't
It
it?
is. It is. Yeah.
Especially when you have to cut stories to fit a page. And it really teaches you that sometimes just really refining a story and just lopping a few words here and there can really tighten a story. So it does, even though it's not, it's probably like one of the least glamorous journalism jobs.
Yes.
It really is such a useful position to have because it really makes you appreciate the nuts and bolts of stories.
It does. And like you say, it really teaches you that discipline in your own, that you can take into your own writing. Yeah. Yeah. I do remember my subbing days with fondness, but I know, Lynne, you still sub.
Yeah, I still do a little
Yeah.
bit here and there just as a break and
Yeah.
to, keep my hand in. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, let's get back to food. I haven't actually had breakfast yet, so I'm really enjoying talking about food. I think that it must be a competitive niche. It is a competitive niche with a lot of people sort of writing in that area. So, and there aren't many publications that use food writers. So has that been your experience? How have you navigated that?
This is really interesting because I don't think there's a conventional way to become a food writer. Even if you look at Terry Durack and Jill Duplay, who've been in the industry for many decades, they came from an advertising background. And for me, I've always worked in media. I started as an editorial assistant 20 years ago at a magazine that sadly no longer exists called HQ. I became a staff writer at some arts magazines. And as we just talked about, I started my food blog when I was a sub-editor at Inside Out magazine. So there's not really an obvious way in. Like, there's not like a degree you can do. So because I did my food blog, some people started to notice me. One of the earliest people to recognize me from my food blog was Joanna Saville, who was the editor of the Good Food Guide at the time. So she brought me on to do some writing for her. And then I got to do some cafe reviews for the Sydney Morning Herald. So even though I was in the media, I don't think I would have gotten any of those opportunities had I not done my food blog, and people could see that I'd consistently been doing my work, and also they could kind of get a sense of my voice and what I was interested in. So I think it's always tricky when you're a journalist because you're like, how much work should I do for free? And I think if it's for yourself, if it's for your own project and allows people to get a sense of your style, what you're interested in, I definitely recommend it. But as I've also found, like, I don't really do my food blog anymore because it would take up a lot of time. And, now I can do paid versions of what I was basically doing, getting to write about food. And also when I started to transition it more into a podcast, I've done more than 100 episodes, but I haven't done as much recently because unfortunately with the pandemic and people having to really tighten their belt, I had to focus more on paid work. So it is a really tricky balance of getting to do the passion projects you love. You also have to realistically pay your bills. So that balance can be really tricky.
Yeah,
that's so true. I think it's really encouraging, though, what you say about how, your blog led you to some really big editors and led you to some big projects. I think we see that with a lot of new food stars as well, like Recipe Tin Eats. If you have a handle on doing those videos and you can get people in and give them like a quick 30-second, grab about what to cook for dinner and that sort of thing, it really can open up your world and give you so many opportunities.
However, I think she's amazing from Recipe Tin Eats, but I'm pretty sure she's been doing that blog for like about 8 years.
Yeah.
And it looks like she's an overnight success, but I think it takes a long time, like Lee Tran says, to build up that momentum, working essentially for free until you get where you want. And that's a long slog, isn't it?
It totally does. Wasn't she working in finance or something? She was
something like that.
a finance person and did it on the side. Yeah. Well, let's talk. I really want to talk about your most memorable meals. Do you ever go back over your blog with this sort of like sense of nostalgia and revisit some of the best meals you've had?
Yeah, that's really interesting because some meals really stay in your head, and
Yeah.
some meals you're like, I remember that was amazing, but I can't remember the finer detail. And I think for a lot of writers, sometimes you really hate writing because it feels like such a slog, but you're always glad that you've done it. And I am glad when I have sat down and spent like hours and hours trying to capture a moment. But there were times I went on holiday and I was like, oh, I'm not going to write about that. I was on holiday. And now I really regret not trying to pin down those details, because once you write it, you can relive that memory forever and ever. And in terms of memorable meals, you have memorable meals for like such a different range of reasons. And sometimes I think there's this emphasis that like the best meals always have to be the most expensive. But, you know, I would say one of my most memorable meals would be, you know, spending a few euros in Paris for, you know, the best falafel you've ever had, you know, in the Marais. Or when I was in Tokyo in February 2020, working on a story for Gourmet Traveler. And one of the best things I ate was in this cafe that had been run by the same brothers since the 1970s. And they're there and they're in their suits. And there was, you know, this would have just only cost a few dollars, but they served this thing called nori toast. So it's just white bread, and in between there's a sheet of seaweed, soy sauce, butter. They run it through the grill so it's nice and crispy and a little bit charred, and really, you know, emphasizes all those flavors. And I remember having it with a friend, and he said it was like Japanese Vegemite, and it was just a few dollars. But in that setting of this cafe, you don't really see many cafes like this anymore, with this incredible retro design with countless kinds of coffee. Yeah, that was a definite highlight for me.
Yeah, because it's more than the food. Sometimes it's the atmosphere, it's the history, it's the service, it's something, and that's great, isn't it? Yeah.
I was going to say, on the flip side, I remember going to this Buddhist temple in Kyoto, probably about a decade or so ago, where they present course after course of like extraordinary presentation. Like there was a platter of sushi with its own rock garden. They had carved beautiful patterns into the shell of a pumpkin. They made these chestnuts with the spikes were made out of like green tea noodles. They wove these baskets out of seaweed, and inside the seaweed baskets were beautiful tempura made out of like actual flowers. So they've made beautiful flowers and deep fried them as tempura. So that was also an incredible experience.
Wow. And isn't it funny, sometimes the best food experiences are the ones that you're not expecting? Like recently I was on holiday and I was so tired. We'd been out the whole day and my husband had booked Finn's, which is a hatted restaurant in Kingscliff. And I was just knackered, and we'd had a big lunch, and I just said, oh, look, why don't we just try and go another night and we'll just get a pizza tonight? He went, no, I couldn't get a booking any other night, so we're going. And so we dragged our 8-year-old and set him up with the iPad. And I ended up choosing this dish. And I just chose it because I didn't actually recognize any of the ingredients in it. It was called fish umami, and it was a new dish on their menu. And it absolutely blew my mind. Like, it was one of the best food experiences I've ever had in my whole life. I put it on the Rachel's List Instagram. I don't know if you saw that, Lynne.
Oh, yeah.
It was just mind-blowing. And, you know, I think, imagine if I'd pushed to cancel the booking and we just had a stupid pizza in the room. So
yes,
there's an argument for having every food experience possible, because you never know when it's going to be one of those ones that'll stay with you for decades.
Yeah.
And can I add, some of the best ones are when you look at a menu and you like have to Google 5 of these words because I don't know what they mean. And then you end up being introduced to some dish or ingredient that you're like, wow, I'm so glad this entered my life, which it sounds like it did with that umami dish.
I still don't know what any of the ingredients were, but the combination was so good. It was just amazing. Yeah. Well, look, we really wanted to ask you, are there any restaurants that you think right now we should put on our bucket lists in Sydney?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's really interesting.
People must ask you that a lot, though, do they?
Yeah. And it obviously changes all the time. New places open, places close. I would say probably in the last year, one of the most interesting places to open is a restaurant called Alia, and it's won quite a few awards. It was, I think, nominated for Best New Restaurant in the Good Food Guide. And the chef there, Paul Farag, is really interesting. So his background is Egyptian Australian, and there's a dish on the menu that is something his dad used to make like thousands of times when he was a kid, which is this spiced tomato fried eggplant dish, which is incredible. But obviously he does his own chefy version. But Alia, which is spelled Aalia, what it does is it takes lesser known Middle Eastern dishes, and he's inspired, like he really gets into his research, and he's looked up like 1,000-year-old Middle Eastern books for inspiration. Yeah, so one of his books that's like from the 10th century, I think it's originated from what is now modern day Iraq. He's got other books that are maybe only 600 or 500 years old that he's used to get ideas, and also highlight that there are all these ingredients that you may not associate with Middle Eastern food, like tamarind, but actually tamarind has like a long history in Middle Eastern cooking. So it's a really fascinating restaurant, unlike any around in Sydney. So I would recommend that.
Okay. That's on our list now.
Yeah, definitely.
Fantastic. It's not just about writing, isn't it? I wanted to talk about your podcast, because how long's that been going out? And tell us how it all started.
It's probably one of the early food podcasts in Australia. I started in 2012, back when you had to explain what a podcast was, and not every celebrity had their own podcast. And I started it because I found, today there are so many examples of that, but back then there wasn't really anything in Australia doing great in-depth conversations with chefs. And you guys would probably know, as writers, sometimes it's so frustrating when you do an interview with someone and then you maybe only have 500 words to kind of capture what they said, and there's so much great material. And I think when you like have an hour with someone and it's a podcast, you really can explore something in depth. And I've been lucky. I've featured Christina Tosi from the Mamafuku Milk Bar Bakeries, Atticus Ben-Shuri, his restaurant has been named Australia's best on quite a few occasions. Samin Nosrat from Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. I had an incredible conversation with Kate Reed of Lynne Bakery, who thought her dream job was to be an engineer for F1 racing. And she did that in London, and it was a deeply unhappy experience for her. She ended up with an eating disorder, but then it actually, in trying to recover from that, she learned how to make croissants, and that actually brought her back to health, good health. And now she's famous for her croissants, like the New York Times asked if
I just saw her on TV yesterday.
Yeah.
Has she just opened up in Sydney?
She's had a Sydney opening on the cards for a little while. She sells croissants in Queensland as well, but I think the Sydney one was meant to open before the Queensland ones. But with a lot of these builds and with a lot of these food businesses, things come up and they get delayed. But yeah, I think it's meant to open. The Sydney Loon Croissanterie is meant to open this year. Fingers crossed.
Ooh, exciting. Wow. They did sound like amazing. She was saying how she recipe tested the same recipe for 3 months, but every day she'd change a little iteration of it until she got to the final croissant that she thought was, the best one to go to market. It was so interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting how she brought her engineering background and kind of, took that same meticulous
engineered the croissant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I know that you also did a podcast with the Powerhouse Museum. So talk to us about how that came about.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think maybe that links back to what we're talking about, like when do you do things for free, and, what is the payoff? So I've been a volunteer at FBI radio station in Sydney since 2005. So that's a long time. And I've had a show, an Australian music show, on there since 2007. They haven't kicked me off yet, though. Cara Stewart, who works for the Powerhouse Museum, got in touch with FBI and mentioned that they wanted to do I think, a food podcast or some kind of food projects, and who should they talk to? And someone at the station mentioned me. And so we had a few meetings, and then we decided to work on a podcast together, inspired by the amazing Powerhouse Museum collection. So they've got, I think, 500,000 objects in their collection.
Wow.
And we ended up taking some of our cues from that collection. So I looked up, I think, tofu and to see what comes up. And you can look up, a lot of it is digitized, so you can look up some of these items online. And there was an amazing story of this woman who, her husband had become a Chinese diplomat and he had to come out to Australia. And they lived in China at the time. I think it was Nanjing, China. And she was like, okay, for me to have tofu in Australia in 1937, I'm going to have to like drag this stone milling equipment all the way from China, because there was just no way she could have tofu in Australia. Whereas now you think about it, you go to any average supermarket, you'll find 3 kinds. So she dragged it all the way. It's called a quern. And so she could like grind the beans and make her own tofu. And I think in the Powerhouse notes, it said she ended up using it for like half a century or so. And I was like, wow, that one item can tell you so much about Australia's food scene, where it's been, where it's gone. And yeah, we use that as a basis for our soybeans episode.
Wow. And how long did you do that podcast for?
It's so interesting because you might go, wow, there are only 6 episodes, but it took from December 2021 until I was contracted from December 2021 till mid-July 2022. So 60 paid days, but as you know, things spill over, and officially it was 60 paid days over.
I thought you were going to say it wasn't paid, because initially when you were mentioning it, you said this is where we talk about, you know, doing things unpaid, but I'm glad to hear they did pay you.
Yeah, no, they did actually. Yes.
And it was probably all that unpaid work you did beforehand that led to a paid gig. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah. I mean, not that I'm saying you should volunteer at a station for 17 years so you can get that gig, but you know, I think we were also getting at this before, like you should do these things because you love them.
Yeah.
Like with the recipe tin eats example, as Lynne pointed out, I imagine she really loved doing that and persisted doing that. I don't think she was going, oh, I'm going to have one of the best-selling cookbooks of 2022. Like you have to be driven by the desire to do it for yourself, because there are like really shit times, and there are times when no one notices, or you're like, why am I doing this? So I think Cheryl Stray, the writer of Wild, had just summed it up really well, that we're all writers, but some of us are published and some of us aren't.
Yeah,
and it's
I love that.
harder to get published, but it is relatively easy to write. Like we all have, if you want to be a writer, the ability to write. Maybe only 2 people are reading you, or maybe 20, but if you really want to do it, you just have to do it for yourself, you know, at first, and maybe it will lead to some opportunities. But you have to be, as we know, like especially being a freelancer and working in media, there are so many setbacks, so many rejections, or you know, stories where you don't really get paid what you should have gotten paid, and you know, so you do have to be driven by a genuine love to put up with some of the BS as well.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to circle back a bit about the payment. How would you negotiate payment for doing a podcast for the Powerhouse Museum? You know, is that difficult because you think, well, that's, you know, this enormous organization, and where does my charging sit in that sort of thing?
Yeah, this is such a good question, because I really hate when they go, oh, can you just quote us? And you're like, I don't even know where to start. Whereas it's a lot easier when there is a standard rate, or you can point to some industry award and it's really set in stone. And I think what helped was I could ask some friends who worked in the audio industry who are like, okay, this is standard. And it also helped, and I wish more people did this, they gave me an understanding of what their budget was. And that is so appreciated, because I think sometimes with these jobs, it's almost like bad dating where no one really wants to reveal their cards. And if they only, sometimes you're like, am I underquoting? Am I overquoting? If I just kind of knew what I was working with, it would take a lot of anxiety out of it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really
Yeah.
hard, isn't it? Because I've got like a form that I send out to clients before I do the meeting. And I'm about to meet with a new client who has sent me all their information and a lot of material that they've put together and all this sort of stuff and what they want me to quote on, but they won't fill out my form and give me that
budget.
ballpark figure.
Mm.
And I actually think that's a red flag because as you say, they always want you to come up with it first. So I just go really high.
Yeah.
Well,
okay.
yeah.
You're not going to give me a budget, all right, it's going to be this. Yeah.
Because that sort of leads us into our next question, which is because you've now got a Patreon podcast and newsletter. And tell us the thinking behind this, because do you think that paid podcasts are an opportunity? Because there seem to be more of them. I know some of the podcasts I listen to are moving to a paid platform. Yeah, monetizing it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I came to this decision, it was during the pandemic. I'd lost a lot of work, as a lot of people had. And I also thought, it makes no sense for me to like spend so much time. Like, as you guys know, running a podcast takes up a big amount of time. And, I would find sometimes I'd spend like, 14 hours just editing one episode. And that's not to include all the other stuff like lining up the interview, doing your research, all that other stuff. And I thought, oh my God, this is a time of real financial instability. And I can't be spending huge chunks of my time doing work for free. And so I just thought, okay, well, I've done like pretty much almost a decade of this podcast for free. And I'm hoping if people have enjoyed it, some of them might be happy to pay. This is how I sell it, from $1.50 a week. So $6 a month, which I don't think is a lot of money. And I have some tier levels, and I would recommend, if you're doing a Patreon or some other kind of model like that, to have those tier levels, because having 2 people who pay you $50 a month really helps, because that's the equivalent of maybe like 16 people paying $6 a month. I found it super helpful because, especially when you're a freelancer, your income is not always consistent, or you might get a job and they quote a really great amount and then you spend 6 months chasing the invoice. And so having a Patreon where I know each month I will get this amount of money, it's not the greatest amount of money, but it is, when you need to get the groceries or pay some bills, it really comes in handy. And it gave me a bit of structure to my week. And so the way I actually pitch the podcast to people, so it's called Crunch Time. And I say it's a weekly podcast and newsletter about all the most interesting things I'm consuming. So the best food stories I've read, the best food podcasts I've listened to, the best thing I actually ate. And I also dive into something I've worked on, because sometimes you work on a story, there's all this awesome stuff, you couldn't put it into the final piece. So I talk about some of the things that didn't go in there. So I also have like special editions I've done. So I did a 2-part Tokyo travel special, inspired by doing some travel writing for Gourmet Traveler about Japan. I did a pizza edition, I've done a coffee edition, I did a roundup about the best food stories I read in the past year. I did the best dishes I ate in 2022. So I feel like that's, I would say, good value for money for $1.50 a week.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But the reality also is, I have a very small amount of people who sign up to my Patreon. A really lovely audience, probably like the loveliest audience I've ever had. And so what I get paid for it probably doesn't fully reflect the amount of time that goes into it. But I find if I'm spending time reading more food stories, that actually leads to ideas for articles. If I'm like actually focused on the food podcast I'm listening to instead of kind of half listening, again, that helps really give me an understanding of certain topics. Like I feel like I know a bit more about coffee than I used to, because I've listened to some really like deep coffee nerd podcasts as well.
Yes.
I think a continual theme of this episode is like, what is the payoff? Sometimes it's not monetary. It is important to have some economic payoff, so you can, continue living and paying your bills. But there are certain things that do pay off. So I've gotten some really good story ideas from doing my Patreon as well. So And also the people are really lovely. Like there's a guy who runs this coffee business, and he liked an episode I did where I mentioned koji, which is the starter that is the base of so much Japanese food, like soy sauce, mirin, sake has koji in it. And he had bought in some koji coffee, which is it's very hard to get. And he was like, would you like me to send you some? And then he sent me some koji coffee and I got to try it. And that was like a really lovely interaction.
Yeah.
Amazing. So obviously you are really deep in food researching. You know, you write about food, your podcast is about food, and you're obviously having to always be one step ahead of what's hot and what's cool. What's your system for, you know, keeping track of everything that you are kind of coming across and kind of structuring it in your work and in your podcast?
So I use an app called Day One, and people usually use it just for keeping a diary, but you can create multiple diaries. So I've got one that's just a journal, and then there's one which I find very handy where it's what I read. So anytime I read anything interesting, I'll copy and paste it and put it into this what I've read diary, and I'll add the link. I've got one for podcasts. I've got one for research notes.
Yeah.
I've got one for story ideas. And then for each project I do, I create this online diary and use that particular diary. So with the Powerhouse project, that was a particular diary. And the good thing about it is it's synced to the cloud. So you might be out and about somewhere and you're like, oh, I just saw something and that would be good for the Powerhouse podcast. So I'll just write it down into this diary. So that's actually really helped me. I'm not the most organized person, but that has really helped me sort out all the different things on the go. And the great thing is it's searchable. So you might read some interesting article about how, you know, for 200 years, Italians really were repelled by tomatoes. They thought there was poison, like after the Spanish introduced tomatoes to Italy for 200 years, they regarded it as poison. And then it's only after maybe close to 200 years where you get the first recorded tomato sauce recipe, which funnily enough, the guy who wrote it down called it a Spanish style tomato sauce, which is funny because we associate that kind of sauce now with Italian food. And it's actually more like a Mexican salsa because it's got chilies in it. But I put that down in the Day One app. I talked about it in a Patreon podcast. And then probably maybe 6 months later, when we were doing the Powerhouse podcast and we did an episode on tomatoes, I was like, I need to talk about that because that's really interesting. So yeah, it helps if you have a system where you can search these stories rather than, go, oh my God, I read something interesting 3 months ago, but I didn't do anything with it and I can't find the story now.
That's similar. It sounds similar to how I use Evernote, except they're notebooks instead of diaries. What's it called? One Day?
It's called Day One.
Day one. Yeah. I'll have to check that out. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds really good. We haven't talked about your books, and you've done a couple of books lately, and I thought they were great. Tell us about how they came about, because they're New Voices on Food, is it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Were they something you always wanted to do? How did you see the need?
So I helped form a group in 2020 on diversity in food media in Australia, because Australia has this amazing multicultural food scene, but the food coverage isn't always, doesn't always reflect that. I think there was a really good story written in 2018 by Colin Ho and Nicholas Jordan for the ABC, where they interviewed all these people who ran Asian restaurants, and they talked about how, for instance, Dan Hong, who's an award-winning chef, he talked about how people are willing to pay $30 for cacio e pepe, which is, a pasta dish. And he's like, it's basically pasta, cheese, pepper. So they'll pay more than $30 for that, but they won't pay more than $10 for dumplings, which are hard to make. Like xiaolong bao is very hard to make. I tried to make it once. Like getting 16 pleats on a dumpling is really, really difficult. And he was like, so it was a really great article exploring why is it that we'll pay way more for Italian food, but Asian food that takes more craft is, only considered of value if it's cheap, or it's only covered if it's in a cheap eats section. And, you know, some restaurant owners talked about how people come in, they just look at the prices on the menu, they won't look at anything else, and they'll just walk out because they're like, I can pay half this somewhere else, not recognizing that there are different levels and craft, you know, craft levels to food. Yes, you know, you can pay a small amount for frozen dumplings from your supermarket, but then you could go somewhere else where someone is making them by hand every day and getting those 16 or 18 pleats in a dumpling. And you should be recognizing that skill. Or you will see someone hand making noodles or hand stretching noodles in the window. And if that was at an Italian restaurant, you'd probably pay $40 for, you know, some pasta. But people are like, oh, I shouldn't pay more than $10 because, you know, that's
the Chinese noodles.
Exactly. So with diversity in food media, we're just trying to tell more of those stories. And, you know, there's just some things you never hear about. Like there's a magazine, an indie magazine started by Roshani Iqbal called Culinary, where she really wanted to showcase these diverse stories. And I think for the first issue, she put an Armenian pumpkin dish on the cover. And I thought, I've actually never seen Armenian food on any cover of any traditional, like mainstream media, mainstream food magazine. And it's like, well, why is it we only see certain things?
Roast chicken.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm really grateful because I feel like once you know about these things, like there's an SBS food story by a Melbourne writer called Audrey Bourget, where she wrote about koshri, which is Egypt's national dish. And the interesting history of how is it that Egypt has a national dish that's made out of spiced tomato sauce, pasta, fried onions, lentils, and rice, like a very interesting combination of ingredients. And I was like, wow, I've never tried koshri. And I went out to try it. It was like one of the most delicious things I'd ever eaten. And it was at a place that was only a few blocks from where I live. And I thought, oh my God, if I had never read this story, I probably wouldn't have even noticed that on a menu. And I think at the most selfish level, like you're going to eat better and you're going to discover more interesting things. But also you discover, okay, what is a history of Egypt that led to this dish? Like you learn so much about the culture of a place, the history. You know, food is about so much more than being fed.
Yeah, you're so right about SBS food. I learned so much reading SBS food, and it is so important, isn't it? Like encouraging those new voices, you know, and new cuisines to come to the fore. Is that something that you actually do? Like, do you mentor young writers or anything like that?
Well, yeah. So with the New Voices on Food books, that was what I wanted to do. But also the thing I also want to emphasize is, so when we started Diversity in Food Media, our group of basically freelance journalists with zero budget, it was a question like, how do we affect change without having, you know, any money or any resources? So one of the things I did was I started an Instagram, Diversity in Food Media Australia, where I started to showcase some of these people who are doing really great work, whether they're doing like food podcasts or, you know, they're doing their own indie food magazine like Roshani was. And, you know, if you're an editor or if you're in a position to give them work, like it costs you nothing to follow this Instagram. And it also takes away the excuse, which is sometimes legitimate, that like, oh, I just don't really know who to hire, or I don't really know who to commission. So just getting these names out there really helps. So New Voices on Food, the 2 books I've done, that was also another way, because all you really need is like an email address. Like sometimes the entry point to something can be really difficult, but it was just, look, just send me something, as long as you're a new emerging voice from like an underrepresented background. So you could be someone with a disability or a First Nations person, or you're, you know, LGBTQ plus. Like we got like a really great range of people talking about, you know, Chloe Sargent, who is an award-winning LGBTQ writer, wrote about her chronic condition and how that really affected how she cooked, but it also gave her some vitality as well. And it made me rethink about, you know, sometimes we assume everyone comes to recipes with the same privileges or abilities, and some people, it might be physical, or it might be, you know, other, you know, there are other hurdles for, you know, when we go like, oh, why doesn't that person know how to cook? It's like, well, you don't really know what they're dealing with. So Yeah.
How did they do? Because they've been sold in bookstores and everything like that, and
Yeah.
not a big income earner, I assume.
Yeah. It's a very indie effort. So the good thing about these books is, so I worked with Some Kind, who are a really interesting company that came out of the pandemic. The guys who run it, Vaughan and Simon, when that very first lockdown happened in March 2020, they were like, how do we help restaurants who are now not allowed to serve people in their actual venues? They can only do takeaway. So they came up with these takeaway books where these restaurants would create these books through a crowdfunding model where if 100 people pre-ordered the book would go ahead. And if they didn't get the minimum 100 pre-orders, the money would just go to the restaurant to help them out. And I think pretty much all of the books ended up going ahead. So they did books with Lankan Filling Station in Sydney, Esther in Sydney, some restaurants in Geelong, which is where it all started, Lee Fook in Melbourne. So some restaurants around Australia. And it really helped. I know Pippet, who did a book, they did these charts that showed you like how many book sales would help like them get, you know, this piece of equipment or, you know, the way your money actually helped supported them. And because of that model, we could do New Voices on Food. We knew like with the first one, we got 100 orders and could go ahead. And so it's not, you know, no one is making Prince Harry style money from this, you know, but getting the book out there, getting people published for the first time. DM Tran, who wrote for the first book, it was the first thing she ever got published. She ended up writing for Broadsheet, for Gourmet Traveller, for ABC Every Day. So seeing her get those opportunities, and I loved her story as this funny, moving story about how her Vietnamese mother had 2 strokes and it actually made her a better cook. It was just such a memorable, funny, moving piece of writing. So getting the chance to publish her was, a real honor.
Wow. So exciting. So inspirational. So talk about your journalism work. Where does that come from? Is it word of mouth? It sounds like, because you've been working in this industry and in that niche for a while. So do you spend a lot of time pitching or do you have some regular gigs?
Yeah, it's a mix of both. There are a few things like I do once a month for the Sun Herald, which is the Sunday version of the Sydney Morning Herald. Do a review on a place, and it's been great to be able to cover like a real range of places. Like I wrote about a Turkish bakery called Malika Bakehouse last year, and I just discovered so many interesting things because they serve Turkish tea, and I was so surprised that like the biggest drinkers of tea in the world are actually people from Turkey. Like
oh wow,
yeah, I thought it might have been China, but actually per capita it's Turkey. And just learning about things like there's a Turkish egg dish called menemen, which I didn't know anything about. So delicious. They swirl tomatoes through the eggs as they scramble them, and there's such a passion for this dish in Turkey, where I think there was a guy who tweeted about it. He's a food critic, and I think he said, should menemen have onions in it or not? And I think maybe 500,000 people responded about whether onions should be. I was like, wow, this
it's very polarizing.
Yeah. But yeah, so I loved, I didn't know a lot about, Turkish breakfast foods before doing that story. And I'm so glad I learned so much from doing that piece. So okay, that's one regular gig. And then there are things that come in. So most recently I had someone get in touch with me from the Punch website in America, which is it's about drinks. They've started to do some coverage in Australia, and they asked me just before Christmas, could you do a story where you interview 3 bouncers for us and then write a story that kind of reflects the Sydney drinking scene? And I was a bit like, oh no, do I do this or not? Because it was just before Christmas, and I thought, am I going to be able to find interviews while everyone's like going off on holiday? And how do I even find bouncers? It's not like someone publishes a cookbook and you just track down their publisher or you track down their website. And actually it was so hard. I think I asked maybe 12 different people and I got no's, and in the end the 3 bouncers I got were so awesome. And one of them, her name is Alex. She's been a bouncer since the late 80s. She had so many incredible stories. She worked at Kinsella's, which was a real celebrity.
Oh yeah,
I love
I went to Kinsella's back in the day.
Like Kylie Minogue and Michael Hutchins went to Kinsella's, and she had a story about how she met her husband from working there because there was an assault there and she had to go down to the police station and make a statement. And then that's how she met her husband, who was a police officer. Yeah. But also she could talk about how much the scene had changed, because she said like bouncers were like answering machines, because you didn't have mobile phones back in the day. So if you wanted to find your friend, you'd have to physically go to all the nightclubs. And, she would know who was where, or, so she had lots of really interesting stories.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, you juggle so many creative projects, it sounds like. How do you manage it all? What does your day look like?
Oh my God, it's a total mess. I don't want to be one of those people who like says, oh, I get up at 4 a.m. and I, write, and then I spend 2 hours at the gym. I'm like the total opposite of that. I find even now, I think I'm in my maybe 6th year freelancing, I find it really hard because the jobs change all the time. So it's really hard to have a set schedule. There are certain things, where you're like, okay, I do this once a month, so I have to, do the research and line up the interview and all that stuff. But I kind of just accepted that you have a lot of imbalance with your life. And sometimes you're completely stressed out and you have 3 things due on the same day. And you just have to cope and have the breakdown you need to have, and then just get on the other side. The thing that I think, the good thing about journalism deadlines is they're relatively short. It's rare that you're like, oh my God, I'm 12 months later, I still have the same problem. It's usually like, oh my God, this story is giving me a headache, but it'll be finished in 3 weeks' time. Yeah. Or I can't find the person to interview, but I'll find someone and I will file it by the day it's due. So the fact that it's short term, I feel like, is the only way that helps me cope. Roller coaster levels of stress.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, oh, cool. We did talk about tech tips. Is there any other? I mean, you mentioned a great one with Day One, but are there other ones that you use that you find are really helpful?
I find Trello boards really helpful. I know a lot of people use them.
Yeah, I use Trello. I love it.
They're almost like post-it notes, except so I use one where it's like one for stories commissioned, one Trello board for have I scheduled the interview or not, one for have I transcribed the interview or not, and then have I filed the story or not. So it just helps me see all the deadlines and the status of stories all in one go. It's very helpful.
That's an interesting way to set it up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, where can people find out about you and find out more about what you do?
You can, I guess, follow me on Instagram. I'm Lee Tran Lam. I haven't updated my blog in a long time, but you can look at very old entries at the unbearable lightness of being hungry.com. You can listen to the Culinary Archive podcast I did. You can listen to Unbearable Lightness of Being Hungry podcast episodes. You can find me on Patreon. Patreon.com/Lee Tran Lam, where you can browse the archives and see if I've covered something interesting you think I'm worth $1.50 a week. That would be really appreciated if you would consider that. So yeah, there are a few places you can
this
find
has
me.
been an absolutely fascinating chat. I like
great.
Yeah,
we're all inspired.
We were.
Thank you.
It's probably not the chat to have when you're really like screamingly hungry, but it's just been so delicious.
And I think your passion for your subject and food is really infectious, Lee Tran.
It is.
I really love it, and I think it's perked us up and made us feel really inspired and cheerful. And I think that our listeners will find the same thing.
Yeah,
we'll put links to your Patreon and the podcast and everything in our show notes, so that'd be great. And it's been wonderful having you on this week.
Can I quickly mention before I go?
Yeah.
You can find the New Voices on Food books at some kind at their website. I think it's also important when you are working the media that you give opportunities to other people and support people coming up. And I'm glad to be able to do that with New Voices on Food.
I think that's great and quite admirable, because the barriers to entry can be quite high, and just helping somebody in that first beginning of their career really makes a difference. I agree. Yeah.
Well, thank you again. Don't forget, everybody, you'll find all the show notes in your podcast app, so you can track Lee Tran down.
Yeah, and I should say thanks again to our sponsors, rounded.com.au, because they're easy in accounting and invoicing software, and they're just made for Australian freelancers and sole traders. So go to rounded.com.au.
We'll be back next week, I believe, with another guest.
We will. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.